Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what is the relationship between followers of the Buddha and governments across the world?
This is a good question. There are many different relationships, both in the present and across time, but a common theme is mutual dependency, but also anxiety. Followers of the Buddha rely on the good graces of the government to continue existing and practicing within the bounds of the law, and the governments rely on the followers of the Buddha to contribute to social harmony and religious fulfillment for the people.
I see, but what of the mutual anxiety?
Governments are anxious that the followers of the Buddha are not loyal to the government but to the Buddha, making them stateless and potentially threatening to the government's power and influence. Similarly, the followers of the Buddha are anxious that the governments will, at any time, strip them of their freedom to practice openly for dubious reasons.
Interesting. I think true cooperation in such circumstances would be quite difficult. How is this resolved?
Oftentimes, it's not resolved at its core, but a veneer of harmony and friendliness is eagerly maintained by both sides to avoid public conflicts at all costs.
That sounds like a recipe for non-public conflict. I think in an ideal world, religions and governments would not mix like that. But this is not an ideal world, and throughout history one can see religion and government interfering with each other like this often. I suppose Buddhism is no different.
Indeed, it sadly isn't.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing Japanese imperialism on Buddhism. What is the relationship between Japanese imperialism and Japanese Buddhism? Why were Buddhist temples pro-empire? What are their stances today? We hope you enjoy. So, what is the relationship between Japanese imperialism and Japanese Buddhism?
To frame the context for this question, we need to define the time period and the socio-political context that we're discussing. For the time period, we're talking about the early 1800s through 1945, covering the late Edo period through the Asia-Pacific War. This is a very wide historical window, but it contains what historians call Japan's imperial period. Technically, the imperial period lasted from 1868 to 1945, but I include the decades before 1868 in my window because the roots of the Empire of Japan lie in the years before the Meiji Restoration of 1868. This is a very complicated and fraught time in Japanese history. Japan encountered Western powers in a way that it never had before. Meanwhile, the influence of Buddhism began to decline after 1,000 years of being a primary cultural, religious, and political force. On top of that, 250 years of Confucian and legalistic military government ended with a return of power to the Japanese emperor and a major restructuring of the government. These changes were also accompanied by military conflict, colonial expansion, and imperial statecraft, all of which ended abruptly with the Allied victory over the Axis powers in 1945. This is the context in which we will be discussing Japanese imperialism. Now onto the context of Japanese Buddhism that we will be discussing. On episodes 66, 85, 99, and more, we have talked extensively about the decline of Japanese Buddhism in the late Edo period and the turn against it in the early Meiji period. In brief, due to a resurgence in nativist studies, the invention of Shinto as a pro-imperial state religion, the Japanese encounter with Western science and philosophy, and a very quick leap forward in military, manufacturing, and infrastructure technology, Buddhism came to be seen as pessimistic, obsolete, foreign, and not suited to a modernizing Japan. This sentiment boiled over into outright Buddhist persecution, described as Haibutsu Kishaku, abolish Buddhism, kill the Buddha. Buddhist institutions themselves had already been struggling in Japan during this period due to several legalistic policies enacted during the Edo period. These policies aimed to root out secret Christians, bring the monastic community back under the influence of the Tokugawa government, and more. For more on this, check out the episodes I listed, Asian Religions Series Shinto Part 3, and the Research Project episode on Kobayashi Issa. What it all amounts to is the following situation. It is the late 1800s and early 1900s, and Buddhist organizations are incredibly poor. The Japanese public has turned against them, and the government has turned against them, and they're in very real danger of going extinct and being left behind in history as Japan catapults itself into modernity. At the same time, the Japanese government intended to prevent Japan from being colonized by the US or Europe. Seeing American and European expansionism and colonialism and its consequences for the colonized, the Japanese government and many thinkers felt threatened. They came to see the world in terms of the exploiters and the exploited, and they decided they would rather be the exploiters. They began their own expansionist practices in Korea, China, and the Pacific. They believed this would prevent their own exploitation at the hands of Americans or Europeans, but it also seemed like an economic necessity to fuel Japan's lightning speed technological, economic, and military modernization. So how did Buddhism fit in? How could Buddhism stay relevant in the increasingly modern world? How could it overcome the image of being foreign, obsolete, and pessimistic? One way that many Buddhist leaders at the time saw was to align Buddhism with imperial aspirations, thereby ingratiating themselves, or rather, re-ingratiating themselves, with the imperial government. They had once been closer to the government and to the emperor than any other religious institution, and sought to reforge that relationship. Doing this required some difficult adjustments and compromises, both doctrinal and ritual. Let's go through some examples of pro-empire Buddhist institutions and how they made these changes. Let's begin with Lotus Sutra Buddhism, namely Tendai and Nichiren Buddhism. These schools of Buddhism both emphasize the Lotus Sutra as their primary teaching. As we have seen, the Lotus Sutra constantly instructs the reader to read it, recite it, expound it, propagate it, tell others about it, explain it to people, talk about it, and convince people about it. No other Buddhist text does this as much as the Lotus Sutra does. From a certain practical sense, this makes it amenable to an expansionist empire. Many thinkers, such as Tanaka Chigaku, who lived from 1861 to 1939, saw militaristic expansion as a chance to spread Buddhism throughout the world. Tanaka was a famous Nichiren Buddhist thinker, a millenarian, that is, a religious person who believed that the apocalypse, or some great and fundamental change, was imminent, and a member and a founder of a number of ultra-right-wing pro-imperial social and religious groups. He was allied with the Ketsumeidan, or the League of Blood, which attempted a military coup in 1932. He was also great friends with Kanji Ishiwara, a major player in the Mukden incident, which was a staged attack on a Japanese railway that the government used as an excuse to invade China in 1931. He was friends with the father of Japanese fascism, Kira Ikki. Overall, Tanaka was an enormous piece of shit. I did a research project which will soon turn into an episode on him and his platform, but the short version is that he believed that it was the responsibility of the emperor to propagate the Lotus Sutra and maintain and support Lotus Sutra Buddhism in Japan and abroad at all costs, even if it meant killing people or taking away their religious freedoms. He believed that this would result in a global utopia with Japan at its helm. We'll discuss in more detail in my upcoming research project episode. The next example I would like to discuss is Zen. Zen is famous for its past support for Japanese militaristic expansion, with some Zen thinkers framing Japanese imperialism and Japan's participation in the Asia-Pacific War as a great holy Buddhist war. Brian Daizen Victoria's book, Zen at War, is one of the landmark scholarly works on this topic, and it draws on writings by a leading pro-war and pro-empire Zen thinker named Ichikawa Hakugen. Hakugen describes 12 characteristics of Japanese Zen that made it amenable to the Japanese war effort. Number 1. Subservience of Buddhism to the state. The policies of the Edo and Meiji periods had successfully brought Buddhism under the purview of the imperial government. Because Buddhism was starved of resources from the public laity, they often were subject to the will of the emperor because the choice was toe the line or we will cut you off financially. 2. Buddhist views on humanity and society. Hakugen seems to think that though Buddhism emphasized the equality of human beings based on their possession of Buddha nature, the doctrine of karma has also similarly been used as a moral justification for social inequality. In other words, whether you are a colonizer or the colonized is not the fault of the colonizer, it's the fault of the colonized because they have bad karma. 3. Protection of the state and hierarchical social structures. Zen institutions had a vested interest in maintaining existing social structures and the state because, as mentioned in point number 1, Zen was subservient to those structures and benefited from them. 4. Emphasis on shunyata and selflessness. Hakugen again seems to think that shunyata and selflessness leave no room for the independence of the individual. individual dissent and objection to participating in violent militaristic conflict or about subjecting others to colonization was stifled by the virtually unstemmable tide of nationalism and militaristic zeal, or otherwise that dissent was muted because of the grander goal, to create a global Buddhist empire. 5. The lack of Buddhist dogma, which left, according to Hakugen, no compelling basic dogma a believer would fight to preserve. Mahayana Buddhism is known for almost total moral relativism, so every end could justify every mean. 6. The teaching that a debt of gratitude is owed to those from whom favors are received. In the case of Japanese Zen, this gratitude was also seen to be owed to the emperor as the head of the entire Japanese family. As in points 1 and 3, Zen Buddhists felt indebted to the system in which Zen Buddhism was continuing to survive and benefit, so to pay back that debt, they offered respect, compliance, and servitude to the imperial government. 7. The belief in mutual dependency, which, according to Hakugen, led in modern Japan to an organic view of the state, coupled with a feeling of intimacy towards it. In this mutual dependency, the individual was seen as beholden to the state, and the state was beholden to the individual. When that relationship worked best, both parties worked their hardest for each other, regardless of differences of individual opinion.
Cynic that I am, I suspect this relationship flowed much more in the state's favor than the individual's.
Well, without getting too deep into it, I take issue with Hakugen framing the issue of the individual and state relationship in this way, and I have other issues with other points that we don't have time for and need not get into. I should mention here, once more, that I'm quoting and explaining his views, and I'm not expressing my own. Now back to the points. 8. The doctrine of the middle way, which took the form of a constant search for compromise with the aim of avoiding confrontation before it occurred. This speaks in part to the moral relativism I mentioned before. Disagreements between anti-war Buddhists and pro-war imperialists were met with compromises, which dragged further in favor of the pro-war imperialists over time. For a modern example, look to American Democrats in government. In trying to bring Republicans back to their side, they compromise platform points to Republicans over and over, but the Republicans never compromise to their side, meaning Democrats get more and more conservative. 9. The tradition of ancestor veneration, in which the entire nation came to be regarded as one large family, in which loyalty between subject and sovereign was the chief virtue. Hakugen is here again seeming to think veneration of the Shinto deities, which were thought to be the ancestors of the imperial family, became prevalent enough even in Buddhism that the pro-imperial narrative and discourse of State Shinto started to spread in Buddhist institutions. 10. The value given to old and mature things. Hakugen thinks that since society was based on a set of ancient and immutable laws, that opposition was unacceptable. There was this narrative that the Japanese imperial government was the longest-running uninterrupted monarchy in human history, so it must be correct and right about everything to have lasted this long. This was a false narrative propagated by the imperial family itself. 11. Emphasis on inner peace, which contributed to its failure to encourage and justify the will to reorganize society. In emphasizing equanimity, outrage at the state of things and efforts to change those things were stifled. 12. The Buddhist logic of Soku, just as it is, which led to, according to Hakugen, a static aesthetic perspective, a detached subjective harmony with things. To seek to change the world was seen as a desire or an attachment that would lead to dukkha. One must learn to live with things as they are to realize suchness. What was once a noble religious ideal, equanimity and suchness, was becoming a doctrine of willing and eager complacency. This, in Brian Daisen Victoria and Ichikawa Hakugen's views, was the formula for Zen's pro-war and pro-empire platforms in the 20th century. These are just a couple of big examples of pro-war and pro-empire Buddhist institutions. There were many more pro-war and pro-empire organizations, and there were many anti-war and anti-empire organizations as well. Those we will have to discuss another time.
Empire is inherently violent. Why and how were Buddhist temples pro-empire in light of this?
This is the thing that's so absurd about when temples and groups were so pro-war and pro-empire. There were Buddhist leaders and thinkers who were wholeheartedly in favor of military campaigns in China, Korea, the South Pacific, and even in America and Europe. How could that possibly square with the doctrine of nonviolence? There are a number of different answers to this question. To start, The Japanese imperial campaign was regarded by those Buddhist thinkers who supported it as a holy war. This was not just colonial expansion with military force for economic reasons. It was a holy war to save Japan and the rest of the world from Western colonization and exploitation, to liberate the rest of the world from what Japanese people saw to be inferior cultures and societies, and to spread what was thought to be a perfect, harmonious culture, Japanese culture. In their view, this culture was not burdened with the shortcomings of others. They saw individualism, capitalism, materialism, consumerism, rationalism, and many other characteristics of Western cultures as inferior, and they saw themselves as opposites, or the correct combination of those things. They saw themselves as a collectivist society, where the needs and wants of the whole country supersede the needs of the individual. They saw themselves as believing in science, but acknowledging the possibility of religious truth beyond that which Western science could comprehend. They saw themselves as rational, but flexible enough to let emotions and intuitions govern decision-making when appropriate. All of this was just post hoc justifications for pitching themselves against the West and for engaging in military campaigns against them, but nevertheless, these were the arguments that were posed. Essentially, many thought that the ends justified the means, but they did not have a realistic idea of what the means and ends really were. Throughout the age of Japanese imperialism, the military and government made every effort to dehumanize the enemy to the Japanese public. This dehumanization is a tale as old as war itself. It's not immoral to kill the enemy because they're not like us, / they are subhuman, / they are evil, etc. Additionally, a lot of the violence and atrocities were concealed from the Japanese public. Most Japanese people did not know the extent of the war crimes being committed by the military. Because the battlefronts were distant from Japan itself, people in Japan could be fed highly idealized and watered-down versions of events taking place abroad. All the while, there were things like the rape of Nanjing and Unit 731 going on abroad.
If you don't know what those terms refer to, note that researching them comes with every possible content warning. The cruelty was extreme.
Indeed. However, the people at home were watching military propaganda films that showed Chinese, Koreans, Pacific Islanders, Americans, and Allied powers as being so weak that they would lay down and surrender, or even welcome their new Japanese rulers. The realities of the war were rarely in the public discourse. Finally, contradictions like this are incredibly human. Many people who would never kill an animal themselves eat meat. Many people who would never kill another person support the military and support war. Pro-war Buddhists did not see a pressing need to square the violence of militaristic campaigns against the doctrine of nonviolence. We've talked about how crusaders in Europe were never really concerned with the commandment of thou shalt not kill. The same is true here. There is no Buddhist reasoning. There's no Japanese cultural reasoning. The fact is simply that cognitive dissonance exists and it supersedes all. Japanese Buddhists then and now were and are human, and they can and do have contradictory opinions and identities without a second thought. To be clear, there were many dissenters in Japan who were anti-war, anti-empire, anti-fascist, and anti-colonialist. It is a very common misconception in the West that every Japanese person was behind the war effort during World War II. This misconception comes from U.S. propaganda that was a justification that Harry Truman gave for dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan. The public was told, we have to do this because if we don't, then the Japanese will fight to the last man, woman, and child. This was absolutely not true. There was a sizable minority that stood against the war and was willing to help stop it. This included many Buddhist leaders and thinkers, and many of their successors and descendants hold high leadership positions in Buddhist organizations in Japan today. Unfortunately, many pro-empire and pro-war successors also hold high positions.
What are Buddhist organization stances today?
Religious institutions around the world are generally more socially and politically conservative and old-fashioned, and this is also true in Japan. That being the case, in Japan, these institutions generally support the conservative government and the emperor. At the same time, it should be noted that the divide between church and state has grown deeper and wider in Japanese society since the war, due to a number of factors, so religious institutions are increasingly apolitical. This helps them be inclusive big tent organizations that appeal to people with a wide range of worldviews and political opinions, and it helps them be off the hook for how their members vote and what they do. The current Japanese Constitution, authored with the assistance of American Harvard-educated legal scholars after the end of the war, explicitly mandates the separation of church and state, unlike the American or any other Western constitution. While that primarily applies to how politicians behave and govern, it also creates a societal divide between the government and Buddhist organizations. In other words, The barrier between the two entities works both ways. Politicians cannot publicly show favor or bias towards religious institutions, and religious institutions similarly have less and less influence and less incentive to try to influence the government. Unfortunately, this mandate is not followed to the letter. We've talked about Soka Gakkai and Rishoko Seikai's affiliated political parties that often vote with conservative parties and hold many seats in the government. In these ways, religious institutions manage to exert influence in government. In the cases I just mentioned, the parties are very pro-military, pro-empire, pro-expansionism, and anti-immigration. Similarly, although there is this divide between church and state, many modern schools and sects of Japanese Buddhism are very politically and socially engaged. They engage in philanthropy and advocacy in many different contexts. This can range from disaster relief all the way to charity activity for world peace, helping remedy climate change, helping refugees from conflicts across the world, and more. In this way, we can surmise their political platforms and those of their individual members. In other words, if an organization engages in LGBT charity activity, you can assume that most of the members are likely not homophobes, or else they wouldn't do the LGBT charity activity. For more on the political and social standings of Buddhist temple organizations, you can easily find English-language web pages for sects, temples, and organizations that contain mission statements, advertise their philanthropy and advocacy activities, describe their participation in various charity activities around the world, and more.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Japanese imperialism and Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be discussing music in Buddhism. Shout out to Tyler for asking, what is the role of music in Buddhism? What are some instruments that are commonly used in ritual? How ought we understand music in Buddhism? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you like our show and would like to support us, we ask that you instead send that generous support to a worthy cause. Currently, that is easing the weaponized famine that is tearing through Gaza. Because of blockades, charities and aid organizations can't do much. The best we can do is directly donate to GoFundMe campaigns or the like. For now, we're pointing at the page for Tashneem Mahmood, a mother of 3 who has lost her apartment in the bombing. If you are able, please send some support her way.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.